So welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to another much to think about episode where we share some ideas and opinions and conclude with a big ol' much to think about. So today's main topic, which is one that is near and dear to my little nerd heart, is character archetypes. What we're going to do is, and when I say character archetypes, the focus of the episode is going to be a discussion of the themes and motifs around a particular set of character archetypes that are important to us or have been thought-provoking for us. But before we get there, I think it's important to talk a little bit about what character archetypes are. An archetype is a literary device in which a character is created based on a set of qualities or traits that are specific and identifiable for readers. Those qualities and traits will then appear in different literary forms across time and culture, and so the characterization tends to be universalized, thus making a character archetypal. Now, I think there are plenty of examples of character archetypes throughout history and myth, and this is something that I've always had fun with. There's a reason why these are templates that have been used for literal centuries. But maybe we can give a quick rundown of some really common archetypes or really classic archetypes. Before we get started on this, each of these examples can be very fluid, and any given character that branches off from the archetype is not a sole or absolute embodiment of the archetype. Often archetypes can overlap, archetypes are quite fluid. The hero, characters like Luke Skywalker, Mulan from the movie Mulan, the 1990 whatever Disney one, movie. The original animated one, like Diana Prince or Wonder Woman in the 2017 movie Wonder Woman, also the hero archetype. The hero archetype is often a character who starts out in humble beginnings, but due to events in the story is forced to step up, take on a challenge that puts them into a wider world that then forces them to grow and develop a stronger sense of identity.
I mean, a long form version of that could be Harry Potter.
Outlaw archetype. From way back in the day, you've got Robin Hood.
From the movie Robin Hood.
Han Solo from Star Wars, Peter Quill, Clint Eastwood in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. There have been many in many different forms, many different genres. The Femme Fatale archetype, so many a Bond character. Arguably, if we go way back to the Bible, Delilah from Samson and Delilah. I think there have definitely been iterations of the Femme Fatale in more recent years that have been written with a lot more complexity. I always really like Marion Cotillard's character from Inception as an example of the Femme Fatale character that is incorporated into the character with into the movie with genuine thematic complexity.
It's also very clever because she's a femme fatale, but she's not real. Yeah. I mean, spoilers for Inception, but
moving down the list, The Knight. I personally think that a good example of this is Mando in The Mandalorian.
Yeah.
Though he, as we will talk about in a couple of seconds, is one of those characters that it kind of has fluidity between archetypes.
Yeah, he's also the outlaw.
But he's also the outlaw. But I do know that, like Dave Filoni and friends and Jon Favreau very deliberately did incorporate elements of that kind of knight in shining armor and the Arthurian fantasy into the world. Like Star Wars has a lot of that. Star Wars is entirely built on archetypes.
The Jedi are knights, but some of them I would say fit the archetype of the knight a lot more than others.
Yes.
So I wouldn't say that a character like Anakin Skywalker fits the knight archetype. Out of all the Jedi, even they're all Jedi Knights, quote unquote, Obi-Wan fits that character description because of identifiable features being the fact that they have an existing setup when you meet them. You meet them, relatively speaking, and I'm talking about Obi-Wan in the prequels more so than in the originals. A man very honor-bound, he's very loyal, he's dutiful. He isn't necessarily in a position of high power, but he does have a degree of authority and title and rank.
Yes.
And usually he isn't someone who has settled down. He's moving around.
Yeah,
he's helping people here, he's helping people there. he's saving these people, he's dealing with this problem. That's how the knight operates. So I think that's why a character like the Mandalorian fits those attributes.
The Wolfman is one that I actually hadn't thought of for a long time. Like the classic werewolf transformation, poor guy is like tortured by this. But I've encountered like a really interesting analysis today that was talking about the Winter Soldier / Bucky, specifically in Civil War, as this archetype. A character who is a good person, but then through some tragic circumstance has this like animalistic and awful version of themselves that they could become completely detached from their sense of self and have no control over what they do. And it's like based on the moon or some trigger.
You can include the whole Jekyll and Hyde thing into that area, even though in some cases it's more of the emphasis is placed on an individual person's different natures, like an animalistic nature versus a civilized nature, quote unquote. With a character like Bruce Banner / the Hulk, I was thinking of like a villain character like Mr. Negative in Spider-Man. There's the whole concept of someone having a split personality where they can be a nice, normal person, but something out of their control forces them into becoming a monster.
Yeah.
Right? It's the same deal, but in some cases the emphasis is placed on the trauma and the kind of existential terror of not having control of oneself.
Yes.
Versus in other cases it's focused on the split and who the real person is behind that even split, right?
Yeah. No, and I think for both of those, like these are classically horror-related archetypes. Yeah. And oftentimes, as I said, horror-related archetypes are kind of inherently tragic. The lovers, so like Romeo and Juliet, Orpheus and Eurydice, Layli and Majnun from the ancient Persian, or I think it's Arabic poem. Two characters, often quite young and to a degree naive about the world, bound to each other. Again, often associated with tragedy and tragic circumstance, but then at the same time, there is something transcendent about their connection. The prophet, a person who kind of is willing to walk through fire for the sake of the salvation of the world around them.
Yeah. Well, I think a good storyified version of the prophet archetype would just be like the Prince of Egypt.
True.
I mean, that's
the literal.
That's one of the originals, I think, right?
Yes, I mean the story of Moses from the Bible is quite literally the prophet archetype.
A lot of Native American prophets that have a very similar archetype to it as well.
Actually, I mean, if we're talking not folklore or like oral tradition legends, but Hollywoodized content. Loved by the Buffalo from Into the West is a narrativized version of several different examples of indigenous prophets, for at least in the North American region.
Yeah.
You know, you have archetypes that are often associated with protagonists, archetypes that are often associated with antagonists. Mm-hmm. You have archetypes that are associated with particular genres of story, classically used with that genre of story. Like I talked about the fact that the lovers often used in association with tragedy. You can also see that the literal interpretation of the archetype doesn't always have to be present for its components to be there and for its impact to be there. And as we mentioned multiple times, sometimes characteristics overlap. So as we said, for example, Mando in The Mandalorian exhibits all the beats of the knight in shining armor, like the Lancelot type of Arthurian legend. But he's not literally a knight. And also when the story begins, he's very much an outlaw too. And as the story continues, he very much makes decisions and acts according to parameters of the outlaw archetype as well. Similarly, as I mentioned, the Wolfman archetype that's used with the Winter Soldier in Civil War is not a literal werewolf transformation. Like you could say, okay, Remus Lupin in Harry Potter is the Wolfman archetype because he's actually a werewolf. Yeah. But the beats are all there, and that gives the story a particular meaning and a particular thematic reflection. Mm-hmm. And archetypes can also transition as characters grow. So, for example, Elizabeth Swann from the Pirates of the Caribbean trilogy begins the story in a bit of a damsel role, or like the princess archetype, I would call it. And then by the end of it, she's very much a leader of a pirate rebellion and has lost all elements of that original archetype.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not because she's a totally different character. She's just grown into herself.
Yeah.
Sidebar, absolute icon, legend, formative, one of my childhood heroes. So the point of the above is to be very clear that archetypes are vital to storytelling. They've existed for pretty much as long as human beings have been telling stories. Like you can see that some of the archetypes were originally found in the Bible or in like centuries old Persian mythology, right? But at the same time, they're quite fluid, and over-labeling and over-categorizing of characters doesn't really do us much good. However, we can learn about and follow particular themes or ideas through certain classic archetypes and their intersection with genre.
We talked about this, I think, in our very first episode, but we haven't talked about it much since, of functionally what the archetype does for people, especially when, like you said, for telling stories. It's a deep part of how we are able to interact with the world. Your thinking is done in terms of metaphors and what you've experienced, what you're familiar with. And so when you have a concept for a character that's already familiar, and then you're introduced to a version of that, you already know a lot more about that character, and then you have certain expectations, you have certain things to compare it to, and then that gives the story the ability to work with something that's already there.
Well, it kind of kickstarts your sense-making ability.
Exactly.
It kickstarts the cognition that goes into meaning-making with a story.
Exactly. And then when all of those kind of network together over time into an archetype in someone's mind, the reason that can be useful, like you said, is that then it gives you a template for how you conceptualize your own life through various situations and abstract kind of layers of reality, right? You don't always have to think about things in the most literal sense.
Mm-hmm.
You can say, well, this situation or this person has these qualities, these attributes that are identifiable in this way, and that lends itself to certain directions of narrative.
I think this is a good place to pause and differentiate between archetype and stereotype. It can be difficult to distinguish between the difference between archetype and stereotype when it comes to literary characters. In general, archetypes function as a literary device with the intent of complex characterization. They assign characters with specific qualities and traits that are identifiable and recognizable to readers of literary works. Stereotypes function more as limited and often negative labels assigned to characters. So my understanding of this is that archetypes' intention is a template to generate universality and complexity, which can be achieved by applying the archetype across genre and context and changing the details of a character's background. Nothing about a character's archetype suggests that that character's story cannot have complexity. Whereas writing a character as a stereotype instead diminishes the complexity because it reduces the character to only the surface level of whatever handful of characteristics they represent. So inherent in archetypes is potential for complexity, and inherent in stereotypes is avoidance of complexity by oversimplifying a situation to only its most superficial attribute.
The archetype gives you a base from which to build, and the stereotype puts a ceiling on what it is going to end up being.
Exactly. Excellently put. I mean, comedy is known for regularly towing the line between archetype and stereotype and subverting expectations for stereotyped roles. Like shows like Community or Parks and Recreation, they do this with regularity and varying degrees of success, I think. Or movies like Shrek, or Get Smart. They present a set of characters or a cast of characters that are all meant to simultaneously represent stereotypes and archetypes, and they have a really fun time playing around with at what point in the story the character goes from one to the other.
Yeah, one of the theories, I mean, there are many theories of comedy, but one of the theories of comedy has to do with things being unexpected and there being some sort of irony or contrast, right?
Exactly.
And so a big part of what you're saying has to do with, I don't know, you present a character that's on the one hand very competent in their role, but on the other hand is kind of stereotyped into being the character that ends up like tripping over their feet and causing a bunch of problems inadvertently because of their stupidity. Same thing for something like Shrek. I mean, you have the character Lord Farquaad, whose inherent contrast is that he's this tyrannical king who's also really short in stature and kind of really pathetic physically. He doesn't fight. He doesn't dominate anyone in any capacity. He's just got some kingdom for some reason. And you never really know why he has so much power. He just does.
Yeah, I mean, or for example, Fiona like toes the line of multiple stereotypes and archetypes at any given moment, and that's part of why she's such a fun and hilarious character.
She's like the ditzy princess, but then she's also uber competent and smart, and she's also a wolf man.
I was also going to say that you can see certain archetypes. Like, comedy is a great visual playing field for seeing certain archetypes repeat themselves over many years. So, for example, Danny from the old 80s show Soap, Troy Barnes from Community, and Andy Dwyer from Parks and Rec are all the same archetype, but they're also each their own unique character.
Yeah.
Man, Soap was so great.
Yeah.
Like, what a classic.
Well, I think another good example of this in comedy, I don't want to really beat this drum too hard, like with comedy, because it's not really the point of the topic, but someone who is very good at this idea was Charlie Chaplin in his movies, because oftentimes the comedic sequences are this dance between his character being competent or incompetent with the other characters being competent or incompetent. Sorry, a movie like The Great Dictator, where this kind of random everyday guy is thrust into being the dictator of this country just because he's
in the wrong place at the wrong time.
He happens to look identical to the dictator.
Yeah.
Right? And so the character is... The situations are funny because this character doesn't know why they're there, and they don't know how to do what they're supposed to be doing, but they're also managing to make their way through it and figure things out, right?
But then if you notice that Chaplin's movies are so, I guess, long-lasting and timeless because all of his stories, or most of his stories, the best ones, are grounded very deeply in the humanity of his characters at the end of the day, right? I mean, yes, it's funny when the little Jewish barber is accidentally put in the position of Hinkle the dictator, but the way that the story wraps up the comedy is to have that absolutely stellar speech at the end about like humanity and the hope and goodness, right? Mm-hmm. Or in something like Modern Times, the comedy at the end is of his song and dance is like very quickly juxtaposed against bittersweet joy and also fear of he and it's like the gammon. That's her title in the movie. Being able to finally run off into the unknown, but at once have their happily ever after because they are together. I guess the point here is that archetypes,
they're so built into us.
They're just, they're like fundamentally built into storytelling, and they are both a tool that facilitates theme and meaning, but also they rely on the vision of the story to be good, quote unquote, to not feel hollow or empty. Mm-hmm. Something that I've thought about a lot have been archetypes of leadership. I think specifically a few key ones, which we will break down in a second, those being the wise man, the good king, and the soldier. I think today we want to explore what are some kinds of leaders or examples of leadership in stories that we can reflect on. Ideals for leadership in story kind of have this back and forth reflection of you don't necessarily have to be a leader or be striving towards leadership to think about and reflect these qualities and grapple with these issues. But at the same time, in the process of thinking about and grappling with and reflecting on these qualities and characteristics, individuals can work on becoming better leaders in their personal lives and in their communities. And I will say that we're going to be spending the rest of this episode talking about leadership and talking about archetypal roles that represent leadership. not everyone has to be a leader in life in the rote and immediate sense. Like, one of the archetypes that we'll be talking about is that of the king.
Yeah.
Most people simply do not have the personality to be in that kind of a role. A leader that everyone looks up to, right?
Yeah.
You don't have to be a leader that everyone looks up to. You don't even have to be a leader of your community as some of the other, or nor like a direct mentor to another person.
Yeah.
But the qualities, I think, are still universal, and some of them are things that we can incorporate into our own lives, and others are things that we can think about and look for in other people that we want to learn from.
Yeah, the leaders you want to seek out.
The leaders you want to seek out, the leaders you want to elect, the people that you want to support, and also like not even elect in a governmental sense, but the kind of people you want to work with in your workplace, the kind of people you want to surround yourself with
as
friends, as colleagues, as individuals with whom you're working to make the world a better place. So, that being said, a quick disclaimer. As my brother pointed out, we are by no means experts on literary archetypes, and as much as I love this topic and every so often have like a geeky nerd moment thinking about it, but the ones that we're going to be describing are not necessarily going to be defined by official sources or literary canon. We're describing patterns of characteristics that are combined to represent types of leadership. Maybe they're officially recognized, maybe they aren't. Like, maybe the characters we talk about are formally online. There's like a database that says this one is this and this one is the other. We're not really thinking about that. As I said at the beginning of the episode, it's a much to think about episode. We're just going to talk. Hopefully there's something to be got out of this. Also, a caveat or to note, some of these archetypes, in fact all three of these archetypes, have historically been inherently masculine archetypes. This really has nothing to do with the applicability of the characteristics and themes therein to the lives of everyone. However, it does mean that inherently there are fewer examples of women in like the history of story that fit under these archetypes. I wanted to say that because as a young woman who has always found the presence of women in story extremely valuable for multiple different reasons, which now is not the place to talk about, I think it's important to know that inherent in archetype is universality. And so the fact that a character is a man or a woman, or has traditionally been a man or a woman, especially for some of these archetypes, is not immediately relevant. However, there is something to be said about the fact that more women should and can be included in these roles, and there is value to that, and there's value to bringing qualities and characteristics and character stories that are related to women's lives under the umbrella of these archetypes.
Existence of traditions in how archetypes are written or expressed, or how they manifest in actual stories, is sort of irrelevant to what we're going to be talking about, but it is relevant to the world when it comes to future stories.
Exactly.
So I think we encourage people for all of these roles that we're talking about to, if you're a writer, to write a variety of different kinds of characters. The soldier, the king, and the wise man are kind of more vague than something like a maternal character.
Yes, and that does speak to the fact that historically men were the default and the most universal, and women's roles or women's capacities were like more niche.
I understand that, but what I'm trying to say here is that a character like the wise man or the teacher could be a man or a woman. It doesn't really matter.
Yes, and as we will discuss, there are many women in that role.
But the character of the motherly character is less geared towards men, just as a fatherly character is less geared. You know what I'm saying? Like,
yes. Main archetypal roles that we want to talk about here, as you said, soldier, king, and wise man. Let's start with the soldier. I don't want to talk, we're not going to talk about this one as extensively later on, but I do want to bring it up because I think that it has a lot of value in thinking about a more localized sense of responsibility and and more localized struggles. So I always like, and when I say the soldier, I mean like the classical soldier, not the action man like Arnold Schwarzenegger type of character. For me, what I have always noticed is that the archetype of the soldier is like area person just wants to live on their insert home here with their spouse, but forces of story won't let them, and it sucks. And then they have to deal with that in, you know, with dignity and duty and general fiber of character.
Duty is always a big part of that character archetype of the soldier. It has to do with the character becomes differentiated when it comes to what are they particularly loyal to, what is their duty to.
The one unifying factor I've found is that they're often a community leader, and they end up looking out for a localized circle of people around them, are very fiercely like protective of those people and feel very responsible towards those people.
Well, I would say, I think from what I understand, the soldier archetype is usually either a protector or a defender.
Yes.
And what they are protecting or what they are defending depends entirely on what you're choosing to place upon that character in their particular motivation. So, for example, you can have a soldier character who is built around them protecting their fellow soldiers in a particular unit that they are in. And maybe that priority or that motivation is at odds sometimes with their defensive capacity with respect to their own leadership, like a king or a ruler that they have sworn loyalty to. You can also have more of a kind of community leader soldier who is sworn to protect a group of people who are vulnerable, like they might be villagers, whoever, in whatever kind of context you want to put it into. It could be just their own family, it could be found family, it can really be whatever you want.
Honestly, the blueprint, the one that I always think of, is Maximus from Gladiator.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's
Russell Crowe, the greatest actor in the world.
Russell Crowe, the greatest actor in the world. Not only is he a fantastic character, and that movie is a phenomenal movie, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more as we move forward. That's like the template for this character. Maximus is area man, just wants to go live on his farm with his wife, but history won't let him. And he inspires the tremendous loyalty of his men. He is respected by his leadership and by his peers, and he is loyal to his position as, you know, a general of Rome, and he's also loyal to Rome, but with caveats. And I think that's a really important element of the soldier archetype, where they often find themselves in the position of not fully morally agreeing with.
They have to grapple with the concept of their duty and loyalty and what they've sworn themselves to. And
because the contexts that they're in often involve people in positions of greater power than them that are corrupt, that are making decisions that they don't agree with, that are stupid, taking advantage of people or moving people around like puzzle pieces. Or
it could just be that there are threats to what they've sworn loyalty to that they don't always know how to deal with. Other than Maximus, you like Outlander, so maybe you can talk about.
I mean, yeah, Jamie Fraser from Outlander, classic example of this archetype. Like, poor guy is constantly struggling with this kind of stuff. Very similar to Maximus, I think, in his story. Area man just wants to go live on his farm with his wife, but history won't let him. And I mean, you brought up a little while ago the fact that like Percy Jackson from Percy Jackson and the Olympians also falls into this category.
Yeah, I think that's particularly why I really like his character, is because in those books, I mean, obviously they're children's books, but the way in which Percy as a character grows into his role as a protector and a defender, and it isn't just, I think, again, similar to Maximus or Jamie, the quality of the soldier in a good sense, like when the soldier is a good soldier, it's not just their ability to physically protect and defend, it's also their ability to inspire and support, right? It's their ability to be the kind of rock that everyone else depends on.
Yeah.
So I think something that I always liked about Percy's character is how unconditionally helpful and supportive he is to everyone around him. You know, he's always encouraging people in small ways. He's a very positive influence, and it's not necessarily a conscious thing. It's not like he's naturally a leader, not because he has a lot of charisma or gravitas. He's kind of a dork, but what makes him inspiring and so dependable is his unwavering loyalty and his genuine sense of protectiveness for everyone around him unconditionally, right?
Well,
and that's something that I think you can see in a character like Maximus, who isn't necessarily seeking power, but he also doesn't ever shun the role of leadership. Like,
yes.
He embraces the way in which he has to assert himself for his men to listen to him.
Yeah.
The way in which he has to fight for their safety, or whether it be the enemy or his own bosses, right?
Yeah. Like we mentioned Jamie, and one of the things that I really love about his character as well, as you said, it's not necessarily just a physical protection. It's like the inspirational, like the fact that the character steps up and is there.
They can also be very gentle.
They can be very gentle. Like emotional support and protection, I think, is something that is very much a part of this role. Just like be a good friend, be a good husband, be a good father, be a good brother, be a good, like all of those different roles are kind of wrapped up in this.
Yeah, it all stems, I think, from the consistency and the dutifulness,
like
and the
steadiness,
loyalty.
Dependability.
Yeah.
The scope of their vision, I think, is just broad enough. Like they are just worldly enough that they understand what's going on and they understand the complexities of their situation, but they choose to focus on the people closest to them and the realities closest to them.
They don't like to play games. They don't like to be like a political puppet or to manipulate people.
Other examples of this archetype, Spirit from the movie Spirit, Stallion of the Cimarron, is this archetype.
But for horses.
Don't at me, I'm right.
You are right.
Like that's his whole gig.
Yeah.
Area horse just wants to live in his field with his family, but history won't let him.
You mentioned Anakin.
Yes.
I think in particular, Anakin in the Clone Wars TV show.
Anakin in the Clone Wars TV show, yeah.
Yeah, not when he's a kid in the first two prequel movies, and not in Revenge of the Sith towards the second half when he becomes Darth Vader.
Well, yeah, I think Anakin is an excellent example of a character that toes multiple archetypes at once and like vacillates between them at any given point in his story arc.
But the kind of young Anakin, who is a general in the Clone Wars, I think the reason that you can categorize him more as the soldier than the knight, like Obi-Wan, is he's less honor bound, more so than he is bound to protect. He's more personable, for example, with his troops, with the clones that he's more friends with them.
Personability is a very big part of this
supports
archetype.
Them. He's more grounded. Obi-Wan is a lot more of, he's not necessarily aloof, but he's more kind of high-minded and detached from situations. He's more rational.
And Anakin, especially in that time frame, again, fits into the area guy who wants to go live on Naboo with his wife and kids, right? Anakin's loyalties are to the Republic, but really they're not. Really, they are to the people closest to him.
Yeah.
And I think that is an interesting reflection of, again,
the Anakin
archetypes.
Becomes a fallen soldier.
Yes.
In terms of he falls from grace.
Yes. I also think if we're looking for examples of women in this role, Okoye from Black Panther is a great and interesting example of this because she like considers her duty to her country as paramount. Like that is her number one thing. And yet in over the course of the movie Black Panther, and I love Denai Guerrera's performance, but she's so conflicted.
Well, her struggles
are very consistent with the beats of this archetype, where circumstances around her change and she is bound by that sense of duty, but her loyalties in her heart are still to T'Challa and his family and like Shuri and the Queen. And that conversation that she and Nakia have is like reminiscent of the main conflict that this archetype has. She is also fiercely protective. She's the defender. She's competent and skilled strategist as the general. Like she fits into all these beats, and I really appreciate her.
I mean, she has the unwavering loyalty of her soldiers.
Of the Dora Milaje. Like she says, "Let's go," and they go. The next one I really like, and I really wanted to talk about, which is that of the Good King, and it's like a branch off of the wider umbrella of the king or the ruler. Other branches like the Weakling King, so characters like Prince John from Robin Hood or Joffrey from Game of Thrones, or the Tyrant, Actually, Commodus from Gladiator is like both of those at once.
He is both. It is exactly both of them at once.
Like 50-50 split down the middle. Yeah. You also brought up...
Yeah, I brought up Fire Lord Ozai from Avatar: The Last Airbender. He's kind of the template, like cookie cutter tyrant king.
With the Good King, there's a much broader scope of vision and responsibility. It's inherently global, quote unquote, whatever the whole of the world they are existing in is. And they must not only consider the people closest to them, but all of the people in their realm, and then also other people with whom they will be contending with outside of the scope of their realm. Often this character is tasked with balancing of decisions, so what is right, morally speaking, versus what is necessary. I always think of that line from Black Panther where T'Challa's father tells him, "You are a good man with a good heart, and it is hard for a good man to be king." I think that that's an essential component of this archetype, of its core conflict and its struggle. I think, so we're definitely going to talk a lot more about this one in a second, which is why we're not breaking it down as much as we did with the soldier one. But here are great examples, or my favorite examples of this archetype. Number one, my man's Aragorn from Lord of the Rings. T'Challa, another fantastic example. Yeah. I mean, T'Challa holds a very special place in my heart. Like, I do want to take a moment and say, like, Chadwick Boseman's performance is what makes that so, and I will always be very grateful to him for it. Master of his craft. Both of those characters, in different ways, represent the role of the Good King is one of abstract moral leadership, that they represent something and their decisions represent something in the arc of the story. They are tasked with understanding almost like the truth of the world that they're existing in and making decisions accordingly. And ultimately, the decisions have to be aligned with their sense of morality and their sense of self. One example of women also being included in the archetype of the Good King.
I thought of this one.
Are the Pevensies from Narnia. Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy, who are like the four...
the Voltron King.
The Voltron King. But they all together, I think, make up the Good King, right? As an amalgam. There's some overlap between the soldier and the king roles, I think. A way that I distinguish the two archetypes in my mind is in undergrad, I had an excellent course in my third year that was a health management course, or like a health and organizational management course. And one of the segments of our semester was dedicated to understanding theories of leadership and management in any given organization of human beings. Specifically, complex or adaptive organizations of human beings where there are a lot of moving pieces that have free will, autonomy, and like unpredictable decision-making power, and also like human emotional needs. And in this course, the theory of leadership and organization differentiates between managers who are more pragmatic decision makers and deal very directly with the people in any given organization, whatever that organization may be, and leaders who are more meant to be inspirational in the sense of the vision of the collective. They represent the vision of the collective. They communicate the vision of the collective. They are able to understand the group's wider dynamic and needs are, and think of the organization more holistically and as related to other things outside of it. And there's a dialectic between that kind of leadership and the more managerial type of leadership that is more pragmatic and hands-on. Mm-hmm. I don't think that the two should be dichotomized or separated. Having said that, the Good King archetype is especially fascinating to me because I think in real life, monarchy has become quite taboo, politically speaking, and like a lot of times people take issue with the concept of monarchy or any kind of monarchical leadership position.
Yeah.
But in story, the characters in the role of king or monarch are at least personally, they've always been, like in this particular role of king or monarch, have personally always been extremely appealing as model examples of leadership and like the type of person I would want facilitating the consultation and decision making of a collective, the type of person I would want to look up to. And I will say that I think a part of this is that stories are meant to be allegorical. And so when you have a story, and this is what you said about archetypes, that you have an understanding of the beats of the archetype based on historical and cultural context, and that allows you to make sense of what is happening in any given story. But that doesn't mean that the like literal granularity of the context of the archetype is the point. People will get caught up over the fact that Wakanda is supposed to be this super advanced nation, but they still have a monarchy. They don't elect their leaders. OMG, what's that about? Like, ladies, I cannot stress enough how little that is the point.
A lot of times, socially speaking, there is a reactionary sort of element. I mean, the monarchies that have existed and the ones that still exist
without a doubt,
are pretty garbage.
Without a doubt.
That doesn't invalidate the concept of any kind of hierarchical structure to social organization. You can get into whatever kind of social theory. There's plenty to actually discuss on academic grounds. But I think conceptually speaking, the idea of leadership in the sense of one person being placed at the head of an organization or a system, whether that's for the purpose of, I don't know, a creative endeavor where you have someone running things based on their own vision, like a director. I mean, you still have in governance, I don't think the concept of a president, for example, is too different from the archetype of the king. It's not crazy different. It's still supposed to be the same idea. You get my point. I just don't think it should be written off just because of how things currently are. And we shouldn't react to it with a sense of like disgust. Like, oh, that's that outdated garbage. We don't need that anymore, you know?
As I said, I think the good king archetype has always been very compelling to me and very interesting to me. I think it's because that there is that sense of responsibility that embraces forces greater than themselves instead of only reluctantly conceding or trying to navigate. The embraces part is really important. In my read, characters in this role, they're often like proactively engaging with where they fit into the grander forces in their world and what their vision is. And that vision is often one that has to look beyond their immediate circle. So, like, I think T'Challa is a great and very practically relevant version of this in terms of leadership that a regular person in regular circumstance can emulate, because, like, his sociopolitical context is oversimplified for Storyland, right? He is forced to think about the world beyond the protection and like his duty to Wakanda as a closed off nation that he feels as king he must protect, and traditionally, you know, has always been protected and kept safe from the rest of the world. And over the course of the story, he's forced to think about not only his responsibility to his people, but his responsibility to the world at large. And his decision making is one that marries that sense of responsibility with moral integrity that allows him to think out of the box. While we as individuals are not rulers of a land, in an age of globalization, we have been forced to think about the rest of the world outside our little circle and our little community. And our decisions are affected by the conditions of the rest of the world. And while the decisions we make might not directly affect the rest of the world, they will indirectly affect the rest of the world. The ability to embrace that while retaining our moral integrity and our ownership of our own choices is an interesting story. Let's talk about some characteristics or attributes of the good king archetype, because that might make it more tangible, understandable. I actually read a really fascinating take on this today that suggested that the good king character is often something of like a Renaissance man. So there's a unique blend of abilities and characteristics that incorporates scholarship, protectiveness and order, inspiring creativity in others, morality and integrity, and also like a degree of spirituality as well. I think that's present in
I completely agree
in pretty
with
much
that,
all of
I think
the examples.
Yeah, I think that that concept of it being a Renaissance man is a very common and important idea.
Characters like this often have a lot of wisdom, but humility. The ability to heal, like a character like Aragorn and his healing hands. I love that quote so much, man. I bring it up like every episode. Or build bridges like T'Challa does, right? There's that ability to bind, make better.
Yeah.
But it's a subtle one. Another interesting take is, as I said, the Pevensies are 4 different sides of the same person, and in their titles, they all represent different qualities of this archetype. So Lucy the valiant, Edmund the just, Susan the gentle, and Peter the great or the courageous. You again see the juxtaposition of a wide variety of qualities that kind of all temper each other to bring a sense of balance and wholeness to the person of the good king.
Yeah. Actually, I would say, I just kind of thought of this randomly, but I don't think it's wrong.
Yeah.
The concept of the good king archetype, and I think it's just easier to say the king archetype at this point, is similar, if maybe not exactly the same, as that of the captain. Particularly the concept of captain in a broader sense. In that poem, it's a good way of thinking about why the king archetype is interesting and why it's so universal. Has to do with, we are all like the kings or captains of our own souls and our own lives.
The poem that you were speaking of is Invictus by William Ernest Henley, and it begins, "Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my inconquerable soul." And then there is the line at the end, "It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll, I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my soul."
Yeah.
That centeredness of character, and you mentioned that the soldier archetype has elements of this as well. Self-possession, honestly, is a unifying factor across multiple archetypes of leadership, and very interesting to think about. I mean, this is also an amazing poem. It's one of my absolute favorites. It's one of those things that just inspires self-belief in you, in it, just because of the language that it uses, that very few things have the same ability.
I know you really like to bring this up, but the question of how someone accepts the role of king.
Yes. Oh, this is one of my favorite elements of this archetype. Every time it happens in a story, it makes my heart warm. Again, the appeal of these characters as people who have humility and are really, they put priority on the ability to reflect on why they are doing something and the importance or the significance of taking on a role of leadership. There's often a hesitation to accept the role as king and a willingness to cede the role to another more worthy character when the time comes, if it comes. One of my favorite versions is back to Narnia, when Aslan asks Caspian in Prince Caspian if he believes he is fit to be king. And Caspian is like, dude, no. And Aslan says, the fact that you do not see yourself as fit to be king is exactly why you are the one most fit for this role. Like, you're not seeking the power. I think this isn't confined only to the king archetype. I think it's a marker of all good leadership that the character does not actively seek glory or power. Like, again, in Gladiator, when Marcus Aurelius offers leadership of Rome to Maximus, he refuses initially. And Aurelius says that, that's exactly why he is far more suited for it than Commodus is. Again, like we talked about Sam in Falcon and the Winter Soldier extensively, but I think he's another excellent example of this dialectic where the entire conversation with Zemo around super soldiers and the active seeking of serum and power and glory as like an act of supremacy is something that makes other characters less suited to the role of being Captain America, being a leader and a symbol for people. And that's where Sam stands out, because he, without hesitation, turns the opportunity of physical power down. And also, he takes a very long time to accept his role as Captain America in order to fully understand what kind of Cap he wants to be and why. You see very similar beats in Aragorn's movie arc, where he turns down the prophesied role at first because he's uncertain of his own ability to overcome the flaws of men and overcome that desire for power and desire for glory and the risk of corruption, right? He does not assume himself to be better than any other man, even though for many reasons he is better than all other men. Over the course of the films, he comes to understand why and how he wants to be king. And he embraces that role, again, back to a very conscientious and reflective taking on of the position of leader and of king. And it's with full consciousness of one's own limitations and reasons and motivations. And I think this last is what differentiates characters like Aragorn or even Sam from characters like Maximus, because Maximus is still in many ways forced into his position, right? He has ownership over his decisions with regards to taking care of the people most immediate to him, but beyond that, he's not afforded a lot of ownership by the story. This is interesting when we think about it in the context of real life, where any given person is often in a situation, because of the complexity of the world, at least in my experience, it almost feels like we're both the soldier and the king. That in a matter of philosophy and worldview, we are the king, where we can take the time to understand our position and understand where our world fits in with the wider world and how to grapple with that and what decisions work with that and what don't, and what moral philosophies work with that and what don't, and how to remain a good person through it all. But then in many other ways, because of the context of the world and the complexity of the world, we are not afforded the agency to make decisions that affect everyone the way that we want to. And we kind of have to contend with forces outside of our control, threatening people far away from us and people very close to us, in both immediate ways and long-term ways. One of the things that I wanted to talk about, kind of to conclude discussion of characteristics of leadership in the context of the king archetype, there's a book called Secret of Divine Civilization, which was a treatise penned anonymously at the turn of the century by Persian scholar and holy man Abdu'l-Baha, who we've mentioned before. He has great takes on many things. So he penned this treatise anonymously to the Iranian government at the time, which was, of course, mostly a monarchy. There were, prime ministers and governors and things like that, but ultimately it was a monarchy. And he was urging them to reflect on models of leadership, governance, and social organization that would be able to move beyond the rampant corruption that existed in Persia at the time. So the book discusses the requirements or attributes of what he calls perfection in a leader. And specifically, if my read of it is correct, this refers to an elected monarch because of the context whence it was published. He talks about how one of the attributes of perfection is justice and impartiality, and then he breaks it down, and the way he breaks down justice and impartiality in a leader is really interesting. He says this means to have no regard for one's own personal benefits and selfish advantages, never attempting to be singled out from others. It means to consider the welfare of the community as one's own, and it means, in brief, to regard humanity as a single individual and one's own self as a member of that form, and to know of a certainty that if pain or injury afflicts any member of that body, it must inevitably result in suffering for all the rest and your own self as ruler. The next requirement of perfection is to arise with complete sincerity and purity of purpose to educate the masses, to exert the utmost effort to instruct them in the various branches of learning and useful sciences, to encourage the development of modern progress, and to widen the scope of commerce, industry, and the arts. I think it's so fascinating that these first two primary attributes of perfection in leadership are entirely outward looking and seeking to empower the collective as a whole. He goes on to say that other attributes of perfection are to exercise mildness and forbearance and calm, to be sincere, amenable, clement, and compassionate, to have resolution and courage, trustworthiness and energy, to strive and struggle, to be generous, loyal, without malice, to have zeal and a sense of honor, to be high-minded and magnanimous, and to have regard for the rights of others. He also, I think, again, because this was in the context of Persia in the turn of the century, they were very much a Muslim society. And so he describes that other attributes of perfection are to love God by loving his servants, which I think is relevant in the sense that, I mean, we've talked about oneness, that interconnected force, and God as love in previous episodes, but to center one's concept of humanity and like the people that one is leading under this umbrella of a unified point through which one channels one's care for the people that they're looking out for.
Although everything is outward looking, there is still a very high degree of personal responsibility to oneself, right? You're holding yourself to a very high standard, and that standard isn't the easiest thing in the world. Like,
no.
this is he describes it as perfection,
yeah,
right? And I think that that's something that's interesting. A lot of it involves first oneself being educated, having experience and understanding, being worldly, knowing what kinds of different people are in what ways and how you need to deal with them accordingly, right? There's an element of real practicality to it that is necessary, and that involves someone, like, you have to be understanding, you have to know where people come from, how they think, you have to be able to, we're going to get to this because this is a great segue, I might as well. Moving to the last archetype I wanted to talk about, you have to be an educator, like he says. And to be an educator requires you yourself to be educated, but it also requires the process of education to be wise in its approach. You have to know how to help other people understand what to teach them for them to be raised up as you should be raising them up. So the third archetype
and the last
of the wise man or the wise woman. And I think this can be mostly centered on the concept of kind of the capital T teacher, not necessarily just like a school teacher, but the truest repairman will repair man. No, I'm kidding.
We love a good community reference.
The big kind of teaching, right? And I think that there are obviously a lot of different versions of this.
Can I pause? That I think what you mean by teacher is someone who is not necessarily offering education in the most literal sense, or like the technical sense, but someone who is capable of uplifting people around them. I think of Socrates in the sense that you encourage people to question, to reflect, to seek answers. Even if you, the teacher, do not have answers, you instill a culture, or you carry around with you a culture of both nurturing and questioning, seeking knowledge and embracing more mundane, like localized forms of knowledge. So it's a very complex concept, but it is also, I think, fundamentally ingrained into the nature of humanity and has existed for pretty much as long as we have.
This is a very flexible category, I think. Again, like the other ones, it can be done well or very poorly. We're going to be talking about the good versions of it. If you want to think of any bad version of this, like think about any fantasy thing where it's like, oh, there's a strange old man on the side of the road and he teaches you, I don't know, how to be a wizard. I don't know. I think I always laugh about in the Simpsons movie where the as Homer calls her boob lady, where she just kind of appears out of nowhere to teach him a lesson and give him an epiphany, and then she disappears. That kind of, I mean, it's a satire of that kind of
and
wise old mysterious mystical character who comes in, teaches the main character a lesson, and then disappears. For some reason, they show up for the sake of story. In my reading of, I really like, I think, and these are all characters that are parts of stories that they aren't usually the main character of the story, they are supporting. Yoda, King T'Chaka in Black Panther, Marcus Aurelius in Gladiator, we've already brought up these properties. Dumbledore from Harry Potter. We've been recently watching Daredevil Season 3, so Sister Maggie,
I think, is a great example.
I
mean, Father Lantom as well.
Also Oogway from
Kung Fu Panda.
Legend. on the highest kind of level of teacheriness. They're older and they have hot takes about life and they have a particular experience. And those characters have usually made mistakes, you know. The well-written ones, like the ones I've said, they've had lives. Like when Marcus Aurelius talks to Maximus, he feels that he hasn't been perfect, even though his character has a lot to offer as far as wisdom. A tier down from that, not necessarily in ranking, but just in age.
Yeah, well, in length of life lived.
The character type that's more of a mentorship or a peer relationship, where they're learning alongside of the student, or the younger character. But they
still have more experience, more
they are still
skill
very
and knowledge.
Much, they're very much in the role of guider and mentor, and they shape the other person's development. Right, and I think in this case, a good example is a character like Obi-Wan, again, Kung Fu Panda, Shifu, Master Shifu.
Kung Fu Panda has the trifecta.
They have the trifecta, we'll get to it. You mentioned Leslie Knope from Parks and Rec.
Leslie Knope is one of my favorite versions of this character because she is constant. I mean, I just rewatched that episode with her and April in the dog park, which is an excellent representation of this dynamic of Leslie, and they like talk very explicitly about it, where Leslie has a lot of experience. She's older than April, and she's always taken on a mentoring and like almost motherly role with April. She's always like there to drop her wisdom and like encourage April to be a better version of herself. But at the same time, Leslie is also making mistakes and also learning on the job. In engaging with April, she learns, she grows. She's still very invaluable to April's growth as a young person, as a... I also think that Marilla Cuthbert from Anne of Green Gables is an excellent version of this. Marilla is invaluable to Anne's development because of her guidance, her support, her experience, and her pragmatism. But at the same, like her mentorship. Yeah. At the same time, Anne is invaluable to Marilla's development. Exactly. And her growth as a person and her learning as she continues her life.
The bottom tier here is something that maybe is not necessarily really an official part of this category.
You shouldn't call it bottom tier. You should call it the third tier, bro.
Third tier. Well, bottom tier in terms of these characters usually have less of an impact on story. That's why I said bottom tier.
Okay.
Is they're usually more supporting. The reason for that is that these characters usually don't actually have a perspective to offer that has to do with the plot. They don't necessarily know what's going on in the student or the hero or the protagonist's lives, but they're always there to offer support and to encourage and to share their own humble experiences. Yes. And that can often also just be what's necessary for the protagonist to grow. So I think an interesting, in the trifecta of Kung Fu Panda, you have Poe's dad, what's his name, James Hong?
Yeah, James Hong. Yeah, what an icon.
Where he's not necessarily at all on the same page as Poe when it comes to his life and
his like dreams and aspirations.
Yeah, and the whole universe that Poe's existing in. But he's still there and he's still helpful and he still cares for him and he still offers valuable experience through a life lived. Now his experience is in noodle making, but his experience...
We are noodle folks.
Yeah. Broth runs through our veins. But he still is necessary for Poe to realize things about himself. I would say a similar character is also Hagrid.
From Harry Potter.
Harry Potter,
I mean, Hagrid has always been one of my favorite characters for just this reason, that he's so important to Harry's stability and sense of self, because he's just always kind of unconditionally been there to support Harry and look out for him. Even though, you know, Hagrid doesn't have a lot of worldly knowledge, nor is he you know, super skilled or intellectual or even wise, but he cares for Harry deeply, and he's always there to offer a listening ear, to offer perspective, to, as you said, offer his own humble experience, and to look out for Harry when Harry needs it.
These characters are very important because of the way they can bridge the knowledge and experience of one generation over to another. And that's really critical to the story of many of these heroes, the arc of character growth that they take.
Well, many of these characters offer both philosophical foundation for the hero to think about things, but also philosophical challenge to the hero. And not just in what they say out loud, but in the presence of their context or their experience in the story as something the hero has to contend with. Whether it be the simplicity of like Poe's dad as something that Poe has to contend with in Kung Fu Panda as like a part of his life, that he doesn't vibe with but is still important and valuable. Or in something like Harry Potter or Black Panther, where characters like Dumbledore or King T'Chaka have made grave mistakes in their past. Harry or T'Challa come to realize that and have to deal with it and have to grow as a result, like contend with the presence of those mistakes in their story.
All of the characters we mentioned in that category, and actually pretty much all of them across the board, have made mistakes. And I think that's a big part of the clash between the student and the teacher that almost always occurs, where the worldview of the teacher is built from their own experiences and their biases, and the younger character often doesn't fully agree with that, or they don't understand why that person is so set in their ways, or why they think the things they do, or they may disagree. As an example, between a character like Marcus Aurelius and Maximus, Marcus Aurelius has a certain understanding of what Rome needs and what he wants it to become once he dies. And he feels as though he's made mistakes in how he's governed things, and also with his own children. And he wants, in Maximus, someone who can right the wrongs that he made. And he feels like he has a sort of salvation through him. And that is wrong of him to thrust that upon Maximus.
Yeah. Yoda is a very, pretty much the exact same situation.
Exactly, with Luke. On the other hand, all the advice that Marcus Aurelius gives to Maximus, all the things he tells him, his intentions for what Rome needs to survive, people of Rome to thrive, are correct. Maximus does need to do those things and to be that kind of person. There's a conflict there that isn't necessarily like one character is evil or bad, or their mistakes invalidate their perspective. In real life, especially younger people, I think can tend to disregard or be like, oh, well, that person is wrong and invalidated because they made mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. That's I think what makes those older characters so interesting and so important. Not only is the wisdom that they're giving the younger character as a result of their positive experience, it also comes from their own mistakes. I think this is something that I feel often in terms of parent-child relationships is important, where when the child realizes that the parent is actually human and they aren't this all-knowing person who's completely flawless, that can be a breaking point where they suddenly feel like they've been betrayed. When in reality, a lot of times what the parent is telling the child is for the sake of being better. They feel like they don't want their child to repeat their own mistakes. And I think that in storytelling, capturing that realistically is something that's very important.
I do think that it's also important to bring up that this isn't just an issue of an individual has made mistakes in their life and you write them off. Culturally and infrastructurally, because often within this archetype, these are older characters. An unfortunate reality of the way that society has been designed and our urban social infrastructure has been designed is that older generations of people are marginalized and structurally dismissed by society. And there has become an ever-increasing gap in communication and dialogue between older generations and younger generations. And that has been compounded by this culture of arbitrary generational conflict where younger generations and older generations have problems with this as well, of dismissing younger people for cultural behaviors and patterns that are far more complex than they're stupid or they're bad. But the impulse to write off the baby boomer generation as having nothing valuable or insightful to offer society as a whole in terms of thought and wisdom, because culturally or historically particular worldviews were very commonly adopted. That's very dangerous, I think. That because not only does it divide people on grounds that are really not strong enough for division, it's also breaking up centuries of patterns in knowledge translation.
This has been a problem for a while. Older generations, when they're no longer productive, they're kind of cast away. The young generation, oftentimes, because they are brought up to be productive and to be useful, their relationship has been cut off with older generations.
Yeah.
They don't need the advice. They don't need that because they already know what they need to do. The whole concept of success has no need for wisdom.
older generations also do not have the opportunity to learn from and understand the transitions in the way that people think and the realities of society and cultural struggle.
It goes both ways.
It goes both ways. And so, I mean, I brought this up because I think that pattern in society is reflected in how people engage with the wise man archetype in stories. Like the number of takes that outright dismiss characters like Dumbledore or Yoda or Obi-Wan or etc. as etc. Another Community reference. The commonality of that, you know, this character made some major mistakes in their day, therefore evil. How are we even listening to them? How can they be of any benefit to the hero in the hero's growth? So fascinating to me as a form of engaging with this archetype that has existed for centuries for a reason, you know? It reflects a reality of existence that you can learn from people who have lived a long life. The way that Luke engages with Yoda is I think the right way, or T'Challa engages with his father is the correct way of engagement, where they learn both from the wisdom that is offered to them and from the mistakes. They are able to move beyond the mistakes because they have those mistakes in front of them and they take the time and effort to understand those mistakes.
The thing that I loved most about Kung Fu Panda, this is a very strange hill to die on, but what I really loved about Kung Fu Panda, especially growing up, was the way that it managed to represent these tiers of relationships in a very genuine way, because oftentimes in mentorship roles or parental roles or in like the old wise man role, you don't often get a nuanced take. I mean, I mentioned like the wizard on the side of the road, and it can be very dumbed down and very silly often. And I think that what I particularly really like about Kung Fu Panda is the way that Po as a character has engagement with all three levels throughout, and all of them affect his life. And then at the same time, kind of nested layers of that, where you have Master Shifu also having a relationship with Master Oogway, who was his master, where Shifu is learning from his own master while he's teaching Po. I think we should end with talking about how these different categories can actually be combined. In terms of storytelling. I think this is actually very interesting because we've talked a lot about overlapping elements, and I think that kind of culminates in this. So go ahead.
One of the elements of kings in stories, or, you know, kings in history, that has always been really interesting to me has been the historical association of kingship with divinity. What I mean by this is that kings throughout history were often or always said to either have a direct connection with God or the gods, be God or a god, or to be divine, at the very least divinely appointed, or have some kind of communion with a power greater than themselves. Now, in real life, I don't think that this has had any real accuracy. But if we look at stories and the beats of a story as a metaphor, or specifically in this case metaphor for leadership and leadership qualities, then there is something to think about there in the relationship between kingship as a role of leadership and the divine. Because, and I say this because, if you think about the lives of particular prophets or messengers of God who are associated with different religions.
You could say central religious figures.
You can see characteristics and qualities that we talked about in relation to the concept of the good king. That combo of integrity, dignity, spirituality, centeredness, power, scholarship or knowledge, the globalness of vision, you know, unconditional kindness and compassion and humility, and most importantly, sacrifice for their people. They've very much explicitly been associated with the lives and stories of, for example, Christ in Christianity, as well as the Bab or Baha'u'llah in the Baha'i faith, like in the history of the Baha'i faith. To be clear here, we're talking about not necessarily the validity of the historical presence of these people, but rather the story that has been told of their life.
Like the Bible, for example.
Within the Bible or within oral and written histories of the Baha'i faith. For example, Christ is referred to as the Prince of Peace. or Baha'u'llah is referred to as King of Kings, in many different iterations, reflects or mirrors this archetype of the good king.
Well, I think even in what we already mentioned when we brought up the archetype of the prophet at the beginning of the episode, with respect to Moses, the whole deal of let my people go, he's essentially the king of the Israelites, no?
Yes, and he was also originally a prince of Egypt. One doesn't want to break these things down in too much detail because they're stories that take place so many years ago. Yeah. But at the same time, again...
many years apart.
But at the same time, from a storytelling perspective, all of these different details of position and role, if we're looking at it as an allegory or a metaphor, as a representation of a type of leadership is very fascinating. And I think that it is interesting in the characters, the fictional characters that we brought up, that Aragorn in the story of Lord of the Rings is very much clearly patterned after the messianic prophet. He comes, the land is in turmoil, and he is meant to show up and bind the confused and scattered men of Middle-earth together. He has his healing hands. The point tying all this together is, I think, who is the kind of leader we are seeking? And I think you wanted to talk a little bit about how this also connects to that wise man or teacher, capital T, idea.
That category also melds into this. Prophets are often moral guides and educators, and they facilitate human transformation, right? That's what you just set up with Aragorn. Even in the context of humanity as being the student, you can see that there's often that challenge, that conflict, where the lesson comes from something that may seem foreign or may seem confusing. When you bring up Aragorn and the land is in turmoil, it's not like he comes and everyone's immediately like, hey, look, it's our king, it's the prophet.
Yeah.
There's always the class. I mean, I think there's that meme from that one, Christian comic book or something, where it's they hated him because he spoke the truth or something. Yeah. The prophets are rejected in their own time.
Have very sacrificial lives of suffering and
But in the prophetic story, the role that they play is both that of a ruler over the hearts of men, not necessarily over the material kingdom.
Yes.
But then they also act as an educator for, the spirit of men to raise them up. And they also act not necessarily in a, again, physical military sense, but they act as a soldier of God. They act as the primary general rallying the cause of that kind of upliftment of humanity, the saving of humanity from whatever condition they are in. Kind of community building and encouragement and consolidation of people and love, and like we were talking about with the community leadership of the soldier. I weirdly, I know that I watched this movie with you and it's definitely a beautiful movie, but I'm not the biggest fan of Studio Ghibli. I find that I really like watching their movies once, and then rewatching it feels kind of weird. But Nausicaa from Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, Nokia of the Valley of the Wind Mobile. I think she's a good example of how these all three blend together, because in that one story, she has the story of Prince of Egypt, Moses, burning bush of an ordinary person while trying to find their way in life, becoming the prophet who saves the land, while also there being fighter who protects her community. She's the centerpiece of they all rally behind her. She's who inspires them. She's the soldier, right?
But she's also the king, because she's also the princess of her land.
She's also the ruler in a more high-minded sense. She has to think about what's good for them. She has to think about their relationship with other people. And then there's also the level of her being kind of an educator. Yeah. She's kind of this weird mystical holy woman who goes off into vision quest with the ohms, the magical bugs, and she discovers spiritual enlightenment, and then she has to essentially bring that back to the rest of her people.
Yeah.
She, through her actions, teaches them how to be better. So I think weirdly enough, she's the best example of how those can combine into...
This is why Nausicaa is an amalgam.
Yes.
Did you like my Andy Dwyer? I mean, we're bringing it all full circle here. We gotta reference the references. That's what this episode is about.
But no, honestly, I think that's a great place to end. I don't know how much else we have left to say about these. Like we said, this is much to think about. What we want to emphasize is that character archetypes should be thought of as more than just templates.
Yes.
Right? You should think about how the organization and common themes of an archetype feed into what it represents for you. Why is that metaphor useful? How can that metaphor be explored in different interesting ways, tie into other stories, how one can be a leader oneself, how you can lead your own self as far as like being the captain of your own soul, and also thinking about more of a metaphysical kind of leadership and where compass of humanity turns and where that comes from.
In times of turmoil, yeah. And I think to reflect on the dialectic between all of these different levels of leadership in the world as an understanding of how the world goes round. Because when those different levels of leadership are corrupted or fragmented or, displaced with terrible things, then very easily we can descend into chaos and hurt and division and confusion and hatred for one another and apathy.
Yeah.
It is important to bring this up because it's become colloquially popular or fashionable in some circles that leadership is a defunct kind of a concept, that we don't want people in positions of power that are like elevated above others.
Not even power or authority, just the putting one person above another person.
Putting one person above another in a hierarchy is inherently bad. And I think that it's very dangerous to go down that road without really reflecting on the why and how of the theory of leadership, of the archetypal role of leadership in human history.
My understanding is that forms are, and I guess you could refer to archetypes as forms.
Like Plato's forms?
Yeah, as like ideal forms. I don't know about particularly Plato's forms, but they're unavoidable. And what's important is taking ownership of them, shaping them, and manifesting them in good versions. How can I be a strong influence while also not putting myself over this person?
Yeah, while also being prepared to learn.
Ultimately, I think we should really think about how we can actively engage in cultivating leadership. In cultivating leadership in its healthier and stronger and good manifestations.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for listening.
Also, again, if you want to leave any comments of people or characters in the archetypes that we mentioned that we forgot about, feel free to do that.
Yeah, feel free to leave them in the comments of the YouTube section or to hit me up on whichever platform that I've posted this on that you found it through. As always, if you have any questions, concerns, comments, reflections, please feel free to share those as well. We'll see you next week.